A key study in the sort of literature on broken windows is something that came out much later in 2008. There's a very famous paper published in Science. It's gotten a million citations. People have gotten nuts for it, especially people who love broken windows theory and love order maintenance policing. This paper by Kaiser, Lindenberg, and Steg basically used a range of disorder manipulations in different sites in Groningen, the Netherlands, and observe whether introducing disorder caused different types of norm violations. So if you introduce litter and graffiti in spots, make people more likely to steal a letter dropped on the ground containing money, things like that. So nice thing about experiments, you can generally draw a really easy diagram, right? They can rule out a lot of things. So you get something like, does disorder affect norm violation, and ignore everything else in the system by law. They found disorder had very large effects on norm violation, things like doubling of the rate of people committing sort of like minor crime or disorderly activities. If you have any background in psychology, seeing a doubling effect in almost anything should raise suspicions, but we'll set that aside for now. Experiments in general, like this one, have what we call strong internal validity because they have an experimental design. You know that that manipulation you did is probably responsible for the effects that you see. What they tend to lack, though, is external validity. In this particular case, each one of these experiments was run in exactly one location in the city. They were small scale, like you could drop a little bit of disorder in one particular spot and see if something happens there. And the norm violations that happened were relatively minor. Normally, when we talk about broken windows theory, we're worried about disorder causing murder, not so much worried about causing people to steal a letter dropped on the ground containing money. But typically, you don't want to run experiments where you're inducing murder, so it's understandable that they're not doing it. But it limits its applicability to broken windows as a general theory. There's also some criticisms have been raised. The best one, probably by Vickers and Backer here, where they raise a bunch of methodological and statistical problems with it, and some other guy complained about it a few years later. So this paper seemingly provides strong evidence for broken windows theory, specifically a micro-level effect of disorder on crime, some sort of psychological mechanism. You don't know what people are perceiving or thinking about that makes them more likely to commit norm violation, but it does seem to happen in a lot of different settings. Okay, so a competing theory for broken windows is collective efficacy theory. This is the paper I'm talking about here, or we'll talk about, is Sampson and Roddenbush in 1999. It's a classic in the American Journal of Sociology. Theoretically, in this theory, they contend that disorder and crime sort of are both manifestations of some latent social control capacity, which they call collective efficacy. And this capacity actually renders the relationship between disorder and crime spurious. So they're saying disorder doesn't actually have an impact on crime. What's really going on is both disorder and crime are products of low social control. If this theory is true, it suggests focusing on disorder is sort of missing the point, that you instead should be sort of focusing on how do we bolster this capacity for social control. And I should actually disclose, so I'm on the PhD CN team now with Sampson, and so we're continuing to work on this sort of stuff. And it's actually funny I ended up on there because I spent my entire time in my PhD program complaining about this theory in one form or another. So funny how things work out. This paper is methodologically really an interesting paper. So it's an ecological study, an observational study, where they used simultaneous equations of crime, disorder, and collective efficacy in ecologically valid Chicago neighborhoods with survey measures they used to capture collective efficacy using a novel multi-level measurement model, and objective measures of disorder, which they captured by having vans drive up and down the streets in Chicago, videotape the sidewalks, and they had pairs of coders code them to get measures of both physical and social disorder, which they then created scales from. Okay? So the system that they of equations that they test in this paper looks like this. They have disorder having some effect on crime, and then they try and see whether this is actually spurious in real ecologically valid neighborhoods with the presence of collective efficacy, and they control for reciprocal effects between serious crime and collective efficacy, that sort of fear of crime effect. What they find is conditional and collective efficacy, there was no effect of disorder on crime in these real neighborhoods. Okay? So a study like this is sort of the opposite of the Kaiser et al. Study. So this one exhibits strong external validity. They're using actual disorder, broken windows theory style disorder. They're using actual crime, robbery and homicide, and I forget the other one, burglary maybe, in real neighborhoods that they've sort of chosen and sampled and put together to match real boundaries in Chicago. Contrast, compared to the Kaiser study, it has weak internal validity. It's a cross-sectional study. It relies on covariate adjustment to get at non-spuriousness. This is something that can be less convincing, especially to the community's research, especially to the experiment people in the room and other people who might be watching, less convincing than an experiment. But it does provide evidence for broken windows at the actual scale broken windows says it works at, which is an ecological scale. Okay, so the key questions here, or key questions when we started thinking about this and working on this, like summer of 2014 or something like that, is how do we reconcile these two studies, which are doing about as best as they can in their sort of respective areas and coming to very different conclusions. How do we improve on these? So how can these be done better so we can figure out if these things are right, or figure out if, maybe these things are actually saying the same thing in some weird way. And then where should we go next with these? And I would argue, my opinion is that concepts from methods and causal inference can give us guidance on where we can go from these, and also what might be going on behind the scenes in the results from these studies. What might be wrong about them, or what might be right. Yeah. So, funny enough, out of this project, I think the only thing we've actually published so far is the causal thinking side of this project. So this annual review of criminology paper was actually started as the front end of my master's thesis back in like 2015 or something like that, and spiraled wildly out of control and resulted in me complaining about causal relationships in the entire literature of communities and crime. So what I'm going to talk about is stuff pulled more or less from this article, though the causal stuff is mostly squished into about 2 pages in there. So first thing I want to talk about is if you've taken my math class, you've already seen this. You know where I'm going with this. If you're a quantitative crim person, you generally probably know at least the beginning of what I'm going to talk about. And again, we'll spiral out of control in a second. So basically, causal effects, the effect of something we're interested in, is the difference between what we would call some potential outcomes. So imagine you got some unit, some neighborhood A. We're going to call it neighborhood A, okay? If we treated this neighborhood, say we just flew a helicopter over it and dumped an enormous amount of garbage on top of it, we would see this outcome over here, the outcome if we treated it. Now, if we don't drop anything out of that helicopter and cover our neighborhood with garbage, we would see some other outcomes. It's the non-garbage outcome in the neighborhood, okay? So the treatment effect of dropping a helicopter full of garbage in this neighborhood is the difference between if we treated it and not treated it. We call this a causal effect or a treatment effect. The fundamental problem with reality that annoys all of us quantitative people is we don't get to observe both of those things. We either dropped a bunch of garbage on it or we didn't. We can't simultaneously observe them both. Because we only see one of these things, we kind of have a missing data problem. We need to be able to compare what actually happened to what did not happen that we imagined would have happened. Okay? With some assumptions, though, we can pretend we saw the thing that didn't happen. So we dropped the garbage, we pretend we know what happened if we hadn't, or if we didn't drop the garbage, we can pretend we know what would have happened had we not. Okay, this is based on, the ability to do this is based on a very simple core assumption to all causal inference, which in the potential outcomes framework is referred to as ignorability. Ignorability just means we can compare 2 different units and pretend they were the same unit if there aren't any important differences between them. We can say, if we can ignore all their differences, we can treat them as the same unit. So if we observe neighborhood A and neighborhood B, we can say we treat neighborhood A, it displays the outcome under treatment. Neighborhood B displays its outcome, we didn't treat it, we see what happens if we didn't treat that. Now, if A and B are exactly the same, then their potential outcomes under either control or treatment conditions should be the same. So we just treat them like they're the same unit and compare the difference between the treated and the untreated neighborhood. This gives us an estimate of what would have happened if I had dropped a helicopter full of garbage on these neighborhoods. Okay, typically we do this one of 2 ways. If we run experiments, we do it with randomization. If you have a bunch of units, you got a bunch of neighborhoods, and you randomly pick some of them to drop helicopters full of garbage on, you compare to the ones you didn't drop the garbage on, you get a treatment effect on average, because by randomly picking them, on average, the control and the treatment will be basically the same. You have enough of them. Another way to do this is by conditioning on variables, and that's what all of those hideous and terrible statistics that people have to learn in stats classes are all about. Usually, we have to control for variables, figure out fancy models to do this. People in communities research, people in this institute very often, prefer randomization for one really good reason I generally agree with. Communities are really complicated. It's basically implausible to say you managed to measure everything going on in a neighborhood, rule it all out through covariate adjustment, and say, I can get a causal estimate. It basically doesn't happen, despite the fact that I publish papers doing this, but I tend to not claim that I can get a causality this way. It's probably not going to happen. Thing is, turns out it's also hard to do with randomization, because ignorability is actually not the only assumption that matters. And sometimes in experiments and ecological research, it's just the first bar you have to pass. Lurking beneath the surface are worse, more annoying assumptions that keep people like me up at night, and maybe after this talk will keep you up at night. So in the potential outcomes framework, there's additional assumptions that are part of this thing called the stable unit treatment value assumption, SUTVA, which is an annoying big name for these things. The two main assumptions in SUTVA are consistency and interference. Consistency means that for any given level of treatment, so if you measure treatment and say assign treated groups a 1 and untreated groups a 0, it means there should only be one type of treatment at 1. If there's not, you can't actually estimate the correct causal effect. This means there aren't multiple versions of the treatment. There aren't compound treatments, meaning you accidentally treated something multiple ways at the same time. Another way to say consistency is the assignment mechanism for treatment doesn't affect the outcomes. This meaning, if somebody got assigned treatment one way, it shouldn't mean that they have a different outcome than had you assigned it to them another way. It's a simple idea, but it's complicated, and most people should be scrunching their faces. I'll illustrate it in a minute in a way that will horrify every person who's ever used a linear model. The next assumption is easier to explain verbally, but is much worse for us, which is called no interference or absence of interference. To estimate a causal effect, we have to assume that any given unit's outcomes are not affected by the treatments that occurred to other units. If I treat A, it shouldn't change what will happen to B. Turns out this happens all the time in ecological studies. Things spill over, neighborhoods are adjacent to each other. It's very hard to rule this out. So, consistency. Consistency is violated when different types of treatment are assumed to be the same. So, imagine we got A and B again. We think we did one particular treatment, but it turns out there was actually some other type of treatment we accidentally did. For instance, we were trying to drop garbage out of our helicopters, but it turns out one of our helicopters dropped rocks. We treat them the same way, but the rocks devastate the entire neighborhood, whereas the garbage merely upsets the residents. These are two different treatments you might treat the same way. If you do that and you treat them as the same, you don't estimate the correct causal effect. One of them devastates the neighborhood, which might cause you to believe, wow, disorder is really bad for a neighborhood, but might not be the case. As a result of this, some of these comparisons end up being wrong. This is something commonly violated in both experimental and observational research. One way it's done in observational research, people really like to use scales of physical and social disorder. They'll combine together like, things like litter and graffiti, broken bottles on the street, all those things. If you combine them together in a scale, it assumes every single one of those things in the scale has the exact same causal effect as every other thing in the scale. That is probably not true, and thus invalidates a large proportion of causal literature using scales like this. If you'd like to learn more about this and cry about ever doing this type of work, I recommend Vanderweel 2022 for talking about consistency problems with scales. Another type of consistency that, if you don't do research with scales, will ruin it for you for everything else, is problems with asymmetry. So asymmetry is a consistency violation that occurs when increasing or decreasing your treatment has different effects. So if you ever work with linear models, they're linear. You expect effects to be aligned. If you increase a unit, it goes up the line. If you decrease a unit, it goes down the line. Okay, reality doesn't tend to work that way. What this looks like here is imagine you have neighborhoods where you've got, say, two treatment neighborhoods, the top one and the bottom one. They both have the exact same measured level of disorder, but the first neighborhood got that level of disorder by recently having an increase, where this neighborhood got that level of disorder by recently having a decrease in disorder. What happens if the increase in disorder causes problems, but the decrease doesn't get rid of those problems? That's an asymmetry effect. Broken windows actually kind of implies asymmetry effects like that just cleaning it up doesn't necessarily solve the problem because people say have already withdrawn from the neighborhood or already figured out how to proceed it. These makes these comparisons between counterfactuals different. You get different causal effects depending on the comparison you make. Okay. Most studies that are quantitative assume symmetry because they use things like linear models. Reality is usually not symmetric. If you stab someone, pulling the knife out does not heal them, okay? Many things in criminology are asymmetric. Turns out it's really hard, methodologically speaking, to deal with asymmetries in models. You have to do things like get repeated measures or figure out clever ways to do interactions or pre-measures, okay? Another way that this arises that people often don't think about in experimental research is sometimes your control condition is actually a treatment somewhere. For instance, you might be doing an experiment where you vary the amount of disorder on, say, a sidewalk in a neighborhood, which we're going to get to in a minute. Well, in some places, if there's already disorder on the sidewalk in your control condition, you need to remove it to do the experiment. Removing that disorder may actually induce a very different effect in the control of a neighborhood that never had disorder to begin with. It wasn't there, so nothing happens. This can induce bias in your experiment. Okay. Interference, the next one. Interference just means treating one unit changes what will happen to another unit. Basic idea here is, let's say we got A and B again. We don't treat B, but by not treating B, A chooses from some different set of potential outcomes. If we treat A and don't treat B, we would get this outcome. But if we instead treated B and treated A, we would get this one down here. We're essentially selecting from a big grid of outcomes. This is complicated. It's unpleasant, but unfortunately, it's really, really common, both in the real world and really common in theories. Broken windows implies that different sort of effects within neighborhoods affecting individual people influences what happens to other people. These are spillover or contagion effects or threshold effects. You get enough disorder in a neighborhood, and suddenly the effect of that next little bit of disorder is really different, and the whole neighborhood falls apart. This is an interference effect. Yeah. So common when participants are influencing each other. It's common when you have porous borders in neighborhoods, or you don't perfectly measure neighborhoods. If you even believe there's a such thing as a perfect measurement of a neighborhood, that borders are fixed. Every person perceives a neighborhood in a different way. Interference effects also include micro-macro mechanisms, things that sociologists like me are obsessed with. Signaling effects, norms, where norms come from, shared meanings of situations. These things are all things that can cause interference effects. Interference gets really bad, really fast, really scary. It turns out to be hard to diagram. This is an interference diagram when A and B influence each other. There's only 2 units here, and there's 16 potential outcomes. These things scale exponentially. If you have, say, like we do in the Chicago stuff we work on, 343 neighborhoods, if you imagine all the neighbors influence each other, you end up with tens of thousands of potential outcomes you could think about. It's not something practical to work with. Okay. Nice thing is you can often rule out this interference by doing experiments. You select units far enough away from each other, they aren't going to affect each other either in time or in space. Thing is, these ecological theories, these interference effects are really important. They're like core effects in these theories. Broken windows is not broken windows theory if it doesn't have those cascades and threshold effects. So if you do experiments where you rule out interference, you might be getting rid of the primary mechanisms by which these things operate. Okay, so you're not even tapping the thing you're interested in. Another thing about these interference effects is that experimental results from doing experiments in the wild often don't scale to the real world when you apply these policies. So a good example of Nagin and Sampson 2019, the real gold standard, was the idea that, okay, imagine hotspots policing. We know pretty well from many, many studies that if you increase essentially police presence and enforcement at hotspots, it reduces crime in hotspots. But what happens if you treat every single hotspot in the city at the same time? It is not just a multiplicative version of treating a single hotspot. because you've just redirected all your police resources away from everyone else to those hotspots. And people also know you hit every single hotspot. Displacement may actually happen there, which typically does not happen in small-scale hotspots research. You can't just say, oh, well, if we treat one hotspot and we treat 50 of them, it's 50 times the effect of one. You have no idea what's going to happen until you actually implement that policy. Okay? Interference problems, mean experiments don't scale. Okay, just kidding. Experimental methods, they're really good at exactly one really important thing. They're good at isolating direct causal effects, incredible internal validity, but not everything can be manipulated. Again, we don't really want to do experiments where homicide is the outcome, typically. I mean, some people want to, but they shouldn't. And also bad at measuring ecological causal processes. So all the things I tend to be interested in, all these ecological processes, how people derive meanings and perceptions of places, how they act based on them, most of those things you can't really manipulate. You can't manipulate people's perception of a neighborhood through ethical ways or something. Okay? Another thing that's sort of a subset of this external validity thing, often the types of manipulations people do in field experiments don't make any sense to the people involved in them. So let's say you're going through a neighborhood in Seattle, you're a participant in one of my experiments, and you come across litter on the ground. In some neighborhoods in Seattle, you might be like, that's a reasonable thing to encounter. If you know anything about Seattle, if you're going down Queen Anne, an affluent neighborhood, really nice section of Seattle, and you suddenly see a pile of trash on the sidewalk, you are going to assume it is either a field experiment or a prank because there is no way it could ever happen. Okay, this is a lack of fidelity. It's not a consistency problem, but it is an external validity problem. Sometimes people will do manipulations that they have a weird effect because it's just never actually going to happen naturally. Observational methods, though, well, they're bad at isolating mechanisms. They're bad at ruling out confounding, getting a strong cause, like strongly identified causal effect. There's an entire discipline that tries to do this. It's called economics, and we all know how we feel about them. It's very hard to do, especially at ecological levels. Nice thing of observational methods, there's a much wider range of treatments. We can use real disorder and other things going on. We can see the effect of homicides on how people perceive a neighborhood or something, things we don't want to manipulate. What we do, we want to manipulate them down. That's kind of a different thing. And we can use real outcomes like murder and robbery and burglary, all sorts of things like that. And the thing that I really like about observational work, despite its limitations, is you're actually observing the real things going on, which is what I actually care about rather than manipulations. Yeah. Which is funny, because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about doing manipulations in public here in a second. Okay, so the idea we had was, well, there's good things about both of them. So why don't we take the experiments and stuck them inside the observational studies? And then we did this for many, many years. So the thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you one example of doing this from the Seattle Neighborhoods and Crime Project. The Seattle Neighborhoods and Crime Project is Ross and I, basically, at this point, but this is all those field experiments we ran for many years and all the work we're continuing to do. So we did a lot of experiments, and we did them for a long time. The experiments component of the SNCS represents over 2,000 person-hours of field work running experiments in representative Seattle neighborhoods. So we did stratified random sampling for every experiment to figure out what neighborhoods to do it in, stratified on collective efficacy and concentrated disadvantage. And we have rich ecological survey data from the Seattle Neighborhoods and Crime Survey done in 2002-2003. So we have all this great survey data. Then we did proper random sampling, ecological sampling in the city, and we just hit every single neighborhood in the city with something. We hit them all. The idea here was to balance all those strengths and weaknesses of the experimental observational methods to maximize both the internal and external validity of our results, because we can use the survey data to test whether the things that happen in experiments seem plausible based on what we know about communities. Okay, I'm going to talk about one of them today so that we're not here until 7 p.m. I'm going to talk about the mailbox experiment. Not my favorite, but it is a good experiment. Basic idea of the mailbox experiment was to replicate part of Kaiser's study, the only one of those experiments Kaiser did that actually involved a real crime, theft of a letter containing money with a stamp on it, which is a felony in the United States. So the effect of disorder and crime on prosocial behavior, and so thieving the letter, we're also interested in the effect on mailing it. Does it, if you drop disorder litter on the ground, people can do three things. They can mail the letter, They can steal a letter, or they can look at it and walk away and do nothing, which turns out to be the most common thing in both the UK and in Seattle, as it turns out. But then, because we've embedded in the survey, we can also look at the association between collective efficacy and the outcomes in our experiment to ecologically validate what we see in the experiment. We should expect to see less theft in a high collective efficacy neighborhood, more theft in a low collective efficacy neighborhood, if our treatment is something plausible to people. We also did some other stuff. We did a large-scale 3,000 letter drop lost letter, the Milgram 1965 experiment. Every damn street corner in that city, we hand dropped an envelope on, and we mapped them all and saw whether they got mailed back, mapped them on the collective efficacy. We did the littering intervention. This was a summer spent trying to get people to yell at us for dropping litter on the sidewalk. So we'd walk down the sidewalk, drop litter in front of people, and see whether we get yelled at. That was a fun summer. You can tell that was Ross's idea because he wasn't in the field. And then we did a litter cleanup, which was my idea, so naturally it failed. The basic idea of this one was to see whether high collective efficacy neighborhoods remove disorder faster, thus eliminating broken windows effects. It actually failed because collectively efficacious people don't just remove litter, they remove all my camera equipment too. So it's actually a hilarious experiment. I'm still going to run a research on that. Anyway, the basic idea is with that diagram I showed at the beginning, we attack different paths with different experiments. Today, I'm going to talk about the direct path from disorder to crime, because it's the one typically the literature is most interested in, but we also updated collective efficacy with a lost letter. We did a litter cleanup to look at the effect of sanctioning on disorder, or whether we could trigger, whether collective efficacy makes people clean up disorder, and then the sanction experiment to see whether disorder changes the likelihood of people sanctioning, thus engaging in collective efficacious behavior. Okay, we did a lot of trials. Okay, I spent every summer of grad school out doing something. The one I'm talking about mainly today is the mailbox experiment, where we ran, 300, almost 400 something trials there across 4 years. We also dropped, as it turns out, 3,400 lost letters across every location in Seattle. We got yelled at in the street a lot. And I put out a bunch of cameras that got stolen many times in 2016 and 2017. Okay, lots of stuff. So, thing is, I said before, we did stratified random sampling to choose the neighborhoods in Seattle that we did our experiments in. So Seattle has about 122 census tracts. We ruled out 2 in industrial area here at the University of Washington, because they're weird. And then we ran experiments everywhere else. All 120 census tracts chosen got our lost letters. The mailbox experiment was run in 20 neighborhoods. They're in this kind of blue and this kind of purple here. If you know anything about Seattle, that's a pretty representative slice of the city for different types of neighborhoods, diverse on all sorts of different metrics, as diverse as Seattle gets. So we kind of carpeted the city with experiments. As a result of these, I know like every single nook and cranny of this city. Like anytime we go anywhere, anytime my partner and I are going around Seattle, I'll get up to a corner and be like, oh, I dropped a letter there. She's like, shut up. So, anyway, I'm going to talk about one. I'm going to talk about the mailbox experiment. So the idea here, a letter containing a visible $5 bill is left near a mailbox out on the sidewalk for passersby to encounter. A normal situation everyone encounters on a daily basis. Somebody putting money in an envelope is visible. Okay. So we manipulate litter and a signboard that's been graffitied. So we introduce litter. This is an actual site in the International District in Seattle, just outside World Pizza, where I spent a lot of my time watching people steal shit. So we put a graffitied sign, we put litter all over the place. We try to put plausible amounts of litter. We did the same amount of litter in every single site. You have to not do some implausible treatment. One thing I don't like in a couple of the experiments that sort of replicated this is people will put bags and bags and bags of disorder down, which is not sort of a violation of that fidelity principle, unless you're like somewhere in New York where bags of trash on the sidewalk are just ubiquitous sometimes. But Seattle, kind of unusual. So enough litter that people can't miss it. And we know because we did ecological validation, where we dumped it down and waited for people to comment on it and listen to them. We also waited for shopkeepers to come out and clean it up and stuff like that. We never heard anyone question that it was real litter, which is kind of nice. We did have a couple people question the letter left on the ground, being like, oh, are we on a TV show or something like that? Which is always fun. No one thought it was an experiment, though, which was good. Okay, Then we observe whether people mail, steal, or ignore the envelope in these two different conditions of no litter and graffiti or litter and graffiti. Okay, we're going to stop more or less here, and this is similar to Kaiser, but we did other things. One thing we did is we recorded the perceived gender, age, race, and number of people in the groups walking by, because it turns out people often walk together, not isolated as experimental participants. This allowed us to adjust for differences between trials. So it might be the case if you ran a trial in the morning and then you changed to, say, a treatment in the afternoon, there might be different people in the morning and the afternoon. You need to adjust for these sorts of things, something most of these experiments do not do. Another thing we did, we were disorder present before we ran our trials, so we could test our asymmetry hypothesis. We could say, oh, well, if our control condition was cleaning it up, maybe it has a different effect than if that disorder hadn't been there to begin with. Okay, we did 368 trials with about 3,500 participants in 20 different Seattle census tracts. For a field experiment, that's a lot. That is a lot of trials. It took a really long time, and it's a lot of participants, which actually gives us immense statistical power. This is very nice. Okay, so again, this is the thing we want to test. This direct effect of disorder on crime. But due to the nature of our experiment, it's something slightly different that we're actually doing. What we're getting is a causal test of disorder, that is litter and graffiti, on whether people steal this envelope or not, theft. But we're also getting a causal test of it on a prosocial behavior, which is mailing the letter instead of, say, walking by or stealing it. And then by embedding it in these neighborhoods with survey data, we can also look at a non-causal association between measured collective efficacy and people's theft or prosocial behavior. We would expect high collective efficacy neighborhoods should have lower theft and maybe higher prosocial behavior. Okay. So the key result I want to get, we ran this a lot. We ran this 368 trials. I spent years doing this. We didn't get an insignificant treatment effect. We got a precise 0 treatment effect on theft. There was exactly the same proportion of thefts in our treatment and control condition. We got exactly 28 in both of them. Precise 0 effect. This is a complete failure to replicate Kaiser. It's the hardest replication failure. Precise 0 is wonderful, right? Disorder, no impact on theft at all. But what we did see is a pretty large reduction in the likelihood of mailing the envelope. The disorder seems to reduce prosocial behavior, but it does not increase people's likelihood of stealing it. Okay. But on top of this, we also had associational stuff. We found collective efficacy did predict consistently less theft. Ecological validity for our sort of experiment. Places with low collective efficacy, people stole it more often. High places never stole it. Collective efficacy was also found to predict prior disorder. You would expect, if the Sampson and Roddenberry model is correct, there should be more prior disorder where places have low collective efficacy, and it's exactly what we found. We found that that prior disorder predicted more thefts. Places that had more disorder on the ground did have higher thefts. But if you remove the prior disorder, we have the exact same treatment effect. Prior disorder, if you remove it, it's still more likely to be stolen. This suggests an ecological effect and not an effect of disorder on theft. Okay, this is consistent again with Sampson and Roddenberry and not with Kaiser or broken windows. The disorder effect persists when the disorder has been removed. Okay, so this work is now in draft stage. I was in Seattle sitting with Ross at his desk writing last week. We're working on it. It's coming along. So you can see how long these things take. I started running these experiments in the summer of 2014. We're only in draft stage now, so inspirational for my infield students. Okay. Other experiments that are interesting. We found collective efficacy did strongly predict returns of all of our lost letters, all 3,000 of our lost letters spread across Seattle. But we found stronger effects for context, like Milgram, Mann, and Harder in 1965. We varied the addressees on these letters. We had a letter to an individual person. We had a letter to a Black Lives Matter organization and a letter to the American Neo-Nazi Party. Turns out people don't like Nazis. And when we started running this, it was before the 2016 election, and Nazis were like, let's pick something extreme that's not going to come up in reality. shit got weird right after that. And then we, of course, mapped it onto election turnout stuff. Because we're like, oh, let's see what happens. And it turns out voting for libertarian parties in Seattle strongly predicts Nazi letter returns, and nothing else does. So fun. Okay. Next one, we found collective efficacy did not predict direct sanctioning of us when we went and littered in public. But efficacy, no relationship with the likelihood of people yelling at us in public. What did, as you might expect, predict people yelling at us was the race and gender of the people littering. You can probably imagine which one of our team, me, Chuck Lanphier, Terrence Pope, or Lindsay Beach got yelled at the most in public. It was a summer of Lindsay being screamed at in public. Okay, so it turns out the contextual, situational, race and gender things trumped the collective efficacy effect. Though in general, sanctions are really rare, even in efficacious places. Most places you can litter and nobody does it. Okay, next, well, we found collectively efficacious neighborhoods really hate my litter cameras, an important scientific result, but this suggests large differences in cleanup speed. They cleaned up not just the litter we put down, but the equipment put down to record the litter, which is a pretty extreme one, because I left one camera up in Capitol Hill, sort of a, I don't know how to call it. It's a neighborhood where people aren't going to clean up litter on the street so much. I left it there for a year and no one removed my camera. Extreme differences, but so much I couldn't actually perform like sort of statistical tests of it. And then another one, well, I decided, well, I'm in Oxford last year for my postdoc. Why don't I hire a bunch of RAs and replicate the mailbox experiment to see if maybe Seattle is weird or the UK is weird and maybe the Netherlands is like the UK. Exact same zero treatment effect on theft in Oxford. Again, a fairly precise zero. We only ran about 110 trials with about 4,000 participants due to the high traffic of people in Oxford. Exact same result. So that seems to hold there too. Okay, we're still working on assembling the big picture on this, but it's a lot of fun and interesting stuff. So, given that, how do we, in my opinion, move forward from here? First thing I'll talk about is, well, how am I moving forward with this? This sort of general projects, set of projects we're working on has spiraled, again, wildly out of control, onto a whole bunch of other papers. I realized after I put this together and walked away that all three of the ongoing projects I mentioned here are just dissertation chapters of mine, which these things never get out. The first sort of paper that this, these ideas turned into actually did manage to come out. It was actually the paper I used for my job talk here, so it worked out. I think it's a good paper. So I got this paper in criminology at the beginning of last year on collective efficacy in the built environment. So rather than looking at sort of micro level things and get nice manipulations of into experiments, this was me sort of reversing it and saying, well, what if what really matters with collective efficacy is urban political economy and larger social processes that go on in these places? Maybe what really goes on with collective efficacy is this social control capacity ties into the capability of neighborhoods to control their physical space, thus constraining opportunities. Okay. So this one finds basically high collective efficacy neighborhoods have fewer physical opportunities for crime in them, fewer things like abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and stuff like that, which suggests some sort of larger political economic process. You can't convince me to do causal models of things that change over the span of decades, though. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. I think it's important stuff to study, and it'd be neat if you can figure out ways to manipulate it, but it doesn't work that way. Next one is Ross and I have been working on a theory for tying these things down. It's not really so much a theory as a synthesis of existing things, often really old things. But basically, Ross is a symbolic interaction scholar, somebody who's very interested in old American pragmatism and things. And it took many years, but infected me with this. And I have turned into one of these people too. And so we have this paper we've been working on for ages on a micro theory of criminal opportunities, using the language of routine activities, but instead doing the symbolic theory of essentially meaning in situations. But the focus here is not on situational behavior, but rather how individuals select into situations or are selected into situations by their environments, how things emerge from those situations, and how those emergences change the actual social properties of places. So, for instance, let's say people get in a fight on the street, somebody pulls a gun and shoots somebody on a street corner. How does that change how people in the neighborhood think about that street corner? Does it make people avoid that street corner? Does it make them clean up the vacant lot on that street corner? These processes sort of spill over, but they come down to like situational emergencies and a change in meaning in place. Interesting stuff. The point of this, though, is to generate testable multi-level propositions for future empirical work. The next one, under revision, plaguing me, haunting me from my desk for a year now, is a paper where I'm interested in bringing the role of police back into the social disorganization sort of theory of collective efficacy. So what is it about norms of intervention? Collective efficacy is like social control capacity. Are you likely to go out and stop things in the street? One thing we tend to ignore is, well, how often is that going out and intervening thing actually just calling the police? And how does that interact with people's perceptions of the police? And also, is it the case that if people are more likely to call the police, does it make the police literally more effective, like you would exactly expect? If you have a neighborhood where people are willing to invoke the police, does it result in them doing a better job? And then do people perceive that as happening? Next, some new empirical directions. These are things that I think someone should give me money to do, or someone else should do. I like the first one more, that's always nice, but if not, you do. The first one is, despite what all of the big data people say, I think we still need large ecological surveys. I've been trying to sell Rob Sampson and Dave Kirk on another PhD-CN wave in Chicago. We're kind of on the 30-year anniversary of the big Chicago studies and the basis for the collective efficacy stuff. So I keep kind of kicking Rob and Dave in our Zoom meetings that we got to pitch a grant for another massive study. I also am working with a friend of mine, Thiago Oliveira at Surrey, to try and pitch a replication of PhD-CN in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is a massive city with really interesting sort of dynamics going on. Unlike Chicago, it's why I'd be interested in doing ecological work there and then embed some things in it, like experiments, a longitudinal study, things like that. Focus here, I think, we need repeated measures. It's really hard to do causal research with ecological stuff. It's a little easier if you repeat the same measures and have sort of multiple panels. And another thing is maximizing variation. Ecological surveys are ludicrously expensive, less expensive than panel surveys of individual, like for delinquency studies, but they're really expensive. So what you do is sample places that are changing rapidly more than places that are stable. So in Chicago, for instance, focusing on places that have gentrified or have lost, for instance, public housing, things like that. I also think that we should incorporate these new measures. A big one is human mobility. One of the great advancements that I like in the PAD study is the use of like time-space budgets and things. Figure out where people go and what kind of context they go in, but flip it around and do it for the residents. Figure out where people go in their neighborhoods or do not go and how that relates to their perceptions of places, and maybe also do it for the next wave of the PhD-CN, which I'm trying to still Rob and Dave on for the panel study. Next one, of course, I think people should do more embedded experiments. I just spent a lot of time talking about it, so unsurprisingly, I think other people should do it too. I think that there should be more tests of these micro mechanisms. I think there should be examinations of things like asymmetries, but I also think a big one is I think there should be a lot more studying of sanctioning behavior. Problem is that it's really hard to figure out how to run an experiment where you like perform some sort of deviant act, especially in the United States, and it doesn't result in people shooting you. Okay. So Ross had this idea for an experiment. These are Ross ideas. He's like, well, why don't we just go and pretend you're stealing a bike in public? And I'm just like, oh, Ross, no, don't make me do it. Please don't. And then luckily, Lindsay and I convinced him that don't steal bikes in public in the US. Yeah, maybe that'll work in another place where people don't have as many guns. We'll see. But I think we can do that. Another one that I'm really excited about, and this is something that inspired some of my dissertation work, is the work by John McDonald and colleagues in Philadelphia doing environmental interventions, things like greening vacant lots, boarding up abandoned buildings. These are really interesting, not full ecological scale interventions, but they're still place-based interventions. Pretty neat stuff. I also think we should be doing more interesting tests of police interventions, importantly, embedding them within ecological surveys and other ecological data, and seeing what happens to people's perceptions and their interaction with the environment. And then the big one, the white whale that Ross and I have been trying to figure out for a really long time is how do you manipulate collective efficacy or social control capacities? These are an ecological property, very interesting, that people have been talking about in some way, shape, or form since the 20s, essentially, really seriously in American research. It seems implausible to manipulate it, so how do we get causal estimates? If somebody has good ideas, let us know. Yeah. Lastly, A forgotten one, something that we actually did a little bit of in the SNCS, but not recently. This is one. Embedded qualitative research goes back to the very beginnings of the Chicago School of Ecological Studies. Sean McKay in 1942, Juvenile Delinquency in Urban Areas, is a mixed method study with a community analysis with embedded interview-based work on understanding the life histories of delinquents growing up in these places. This sort of idea of closely linking your quantitative and qualitative stuff has sometimes been lost by people who diverge and purely do quantitative stuff. This guy, unfortunately, I need students. Yeah, I think we should return to that. A good model for this that's been done recently was St. John 2007, which is, what is that, Pockets of Crime. He came up with the idea, well, why don't we test the assumptions built into broken windows and collective evidence theory? Basic one with broken windows is a potential offender sees disorder and they interpret that as it being a better place to commit crime because they're less likely to get caught. How do you figure that out? Go find people who commit robbery and ask them what they think about disorder. And you'll find out that they're like, who the hell would think that? That's what they say. They're like, no, we look for good opportunities. I look for a place where I can find lone people carrying cash from an ATM where no one's going to stop me. Sometimes there's a lot of litter or graffiti or panhandling there, but usually not. Sometimes you just ask and get it some stuff. My students have heard me talk about this. Beautiful paper, or beautiful book. Okay. I also think new theoretical directions are important. This is stuff I'm interested in working on, but I think everybody should kind of go in these directions. A big one, which is unsurprising if you know anything about Ross, who's infected me with all his theoretical ideas, is I think communities theory desperately needs to become very focused on analytical sociology, mechanism-based, multi-level focus. I don't think you should be doing ecological work that does not have a clear micro foundation and mechanisms linking community processes to individual behavior. These sort of mechanisms, what goes on like in collective efficacy, the mechanisms are often ill-specified, untested, or just sort of ignored, saying, oh, we have this ecological thing that does these things. How does it do it? No, we don't know. Right, that's so much of some early mid-social organizations better about this, but collective efficacy, I criticized Rob for making a purely ecological relationship theory with no plausible micro. Important in this then is micro, macro, and macro transitions. How do community properties influence individual behavior? This is something that, for instance, situational action theory has been focusing a lot on how do the macro level conditions change individual people's actions within situations. That is not something I'm particularly interested in, funny enough. I'm much more interested in how do micro level occurrences influence macro level conditions. Ross and I are sort of more obsessed with emergence of situations and how it generates meanings and norms in places. So that's why I tend to focus on why we're working on a different theory that's more micro macro focused. Good stuff in this, Matsueda 2017, but also talking about more situational action theory, Wikström and Cronenberg there. Last one, community theories are often not particularly policy relevant. There's been some pretty good criticism, especially recently, about the failure of community theories to effectively influence policy, with the exception of broken windows, the most influential recent criminological theory on public policy. Most of social disorganization work hasn't really been very successful for the last 100 years in really getting any policy done. I argue that a lot of this is actually due to people not knowing how any of this stuff works. If you don't know how the mechanisms operate, you probably can't craft effective policy to get anything done. So I think to make ecological research more relevant to policy, you need to pay more attention to social processes that will actually incur an application. If you do experiments that isolate small things going on, you miss many of the most important mechanisms, which are these interference effects and contagions and spillovers that get ruled out in experiments. Also means we need to pay attention to complex systemic relationships. So if you go and manipulate something in a community, turns out all the other communities change in certain ways or react to it in different ways. If you go and do an intervention that successfully reduces crime in one particular place, it might result in property values going up, people selling their houses in the neighborhood changing rapidly. Okay? If you do some sort of intervention that changes how people perceive the police, it might result in them calling the police more, or calling the police less, things like that, which then puts different sorts of strains on government, causing them to behave differently toward that neighborhood. These processes are complex and you'll never isolate them in experiments. Problematic. Okay. So before I go to Q&A, I just want to say, these findings and this work was the result of a lot of work by a lot of people. I spent a lot of time in the field with Antoinette Berry, Chris Hess, John Reverso, Kate O'Neill, Terrence Pope, many of whom who are on the job market or recently got jobs across the place. We're spread everywhere, these people. And we also receive a lot of funding and support from other places. It's really hard to do this sort of work at large scale without like a large team of really effective people. So it's important that I mention that they're there. So that's what I got for you. I hope it wasn't deathly boring. And I hope I'm not too over time. I'm a little bad, but not.
So we have a little bit of time left for discussion. We had some questions online. I just would like to point out here that the discussions that we have on communities and neighborhoods and crime is something that has been a core concern of the Institute of Criminology for a very long time. And I'm particularly glad that one of the representatives of community criminology in Cambridge is here with us, Professor Tony Buttons, who has brought to a large extent community criminology to the Institute. So thanks a lot for coming and listening. So here we are. Can I just, there are some exceptions for asking questions, and I think I would like to start to give Tony the opportunity, if you would like to ask a question now, whether you wanted to ask a question listening to the presentation by Charles and the comments.
I'm sorry, I thought the seminar started at 5:30, so I missed the first bit. You started at 5:15, did you?
Yeah.
One of the things that always interested me about broken windows, which is obviously where you started, is that you could apparently get short-term effects for effects of disorder on behavior, as in the Kieser experiments. But the people, you may have mentioned this, I'm not sure whether you did before I came in, the long-term effects by people like Sampson and Taylor, Ralph Taylor, were basically not there. That has always seemed to me to be very interesting, and it's essentially about what's the relationship between something that happens in the short term and something that happens in the longer term. A very simple, potentially causal explanation of that is that in neighborhoods with higher collective efficacy, then if something bad starts to happen, then those people move in and sort it out. In areas with no collective efficacy, that might be less the case. So it does seem to me that in your later developments, you didn't say a lot about the longitudinal dimension. But it does seem to me that the longitudinal dimension may be really rather important here. And that also raises questions about the experimental method, because the experimental method is, of course, about short-term effects. And so, in a sense, the long-term effects that the long-term non-effects that were found by Sampson and Taylor are not dissimilar to the short-term effects that you found in Seattle. And so, in a sense, it's curious. And so, the really interesting question is, how on earth did you get different results than Kieser? And I don't have a clue about the answer to that. Maybe you have.
So the interesting thing was Volcker went and replicated the mailbox experiment in the exact same sidewalk that Kaiser et al. Ran their initial experiment and failed to replicate it in that site. So I suspect this is one of the great things about, for instance, p-values and things. It may have been an odd result, but I'm not entirely sure. Nobody, then again, Cushing and Vorberg managed to replicate it outside of dormitories in Germany, I think. I don't know, it's an odd result. My opinion is somebody should fly me to the Netherlands for a vacation to run many of these experiments over and over and see what happens. But I don't have a good explanation, but we do have consistently different results having run them in Oxford and Seattle. So I don't know what to make of it. And on the longitudinal side, yeah, Ross and I spent some time discussing how we can get longer changes. So, the idea that perhaps repeated exposure over time changes people's perceptions of places and things, just something key to the theoretical perspective we have. But doing that with a manipulation and testing is, of course, quite challenging. But it's something we've been thinking about. Was the idea behind the cleanup experiment also was to see maybe collective efficacious places, they clean up things faster so there's less exposure. But that didn't pan out because people destroyed my equipment. So.
Because just developing that, if it's the case that, sure, the wider environmental dimension actually has different effects on a short-term situation, then that is going to limit the value of experimental methods in this kind of work.
Yeah, I suspect that that's the case, that if, for instance, we could litter the entire neighborhood, I would expect to see different effects than littering one location. And that's the interference thing where we can't drop bags of garbage from a helicopter. I would like to for multiple reasons, but that would be much more likely to generate some kind of effect, I would think. But, with an ecological theory, you would expect an ecological manipulation to have an effect, whereas these small scale ones, I kind of was expecting not to see anything.
I would like to, so we had a number of questions on Slido. We have 7 questions so far. And what I suggest, given time, that I would like to read out the questions as they've come in, and then you pick whichever question you want to answer. I will show you I will show you these questions in a minute so that you can also have a look at them. But I want to read them out to everybody so that everybody knows what questions have come in. There were 2 questions regarding what you mean by neighborhoods. Whether you could explain a little bit more what you mean by neighborhoods, but then there was a separate question that had the most likes so far, namely, given that local communities are increasingly communicating online, so neighborhood WhatsApp, Facebook groups, how might we go about capturing that in experiments? Then there was a question about, did you find any differences in any of the other outcomes, depending on whether people were alone or in groups? So kind of like, is there a context effect on whether there are people standing around, bystanders, if you will. Then there was a question whether your take is on the quality. I think that goes back to the question about causal inference that you started with. What is the quality of quasi-experiments like lockdowns or police strikes and so on for assess, for causal inference? Then there was a question about, is the effect of collective efficacy in the male experiment really an effect of collective efficacy, or is it that there are just different people in different places? How is disorder defined? So this is another definitional. What do you mean by disorder? And why is it not crime that causes disorder? And is there a need to speak about a specific type of crime? And the final question was, can males that generalize to other crimes if offender motivation is different between instrumental and expressive crimes? But I'll give you this as in the menu. You can make a decision on which ones you want, or which one or ones you want to choose. Probably focus on 2 maybe, and with short answers.
Yeah, first one, given the local communities are increasingly communicating online, how am I going to go about capturing that in experiments? There's different ways you can be able to do that. One is if you're actually interested in behavior in those online communities, and there's different ways to do manipulations work in that. If you're more interested in if that's a place where people generate their sort of networks of influence and their norm generation and communities on platforms, for instance, Nextdoor, the hellscape of neighborhoods. I actually have data from Nextdoor because the reason I found out people threw away all of my litter cameras in my experiment was I went on Nextdoor and found my cameras and got them back. And I discovered that it was people on Nextdoor pointing them out, encouraging each other and egging each other on, and then borrowing tools from a local tool co-op to go and cut my cables and take my cameras. So those platforms, I think, in actually some ways are strengthening some of these neighborhood bonds and increasing people's social control through what Coleman would call zeal effects, which somebody's interested in that. Buy me a beer is all rant forever. Next one. Do you find different outcomes depending on whether people were alone in groups? Yes, people in groups steal less things, though sometimes they do steal things. Bystanders too. Reduce the likelihood of theft, as you might expect, though we did see many brazen thefts where despite there being people around, somebody would grab it, rip it open, grab the money and walk away. So some people simply do not care. People come in with different sort of backgrounds. What's your take on the quality of quasi experiments like lockdowns or police strikes for causal inference? Using them for causal inference hinges on the idea that they are essentially could be treated as an exogenous shock. So if your police strike is not related to in any way to the conditions you're interested in their effects on, you could use it. Most of the time, that is not the case, in my opinion, and I'm very strongly critical of a lot of quasi experiments involving policing. Again, buy me a beer if you're interested in this. I've written some notes and things, and I have a comment pending at Criminology and Public Policy on a article from a while back. I'll answer one more, which is, could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by neighborhoods? That is the eternal problem of communities research. How do people define neighborhoods? There's any defined sort of space. Every person carries with them their own sort of idea of what a neighborhood is. And I believe generally people's, if you think of, say somebody wants to develop public housing in the United States. If you think that that public housing is in your neighborhood, you're worried about it affecting your property values and you do something about it. If you think it is not in your neighborhood, you might not intervene. So one way you can figure out what people count as a neighborhood is what they're willing to do, what they will willing to act on as if it is in their space. It's different for every single person. So any community study is essentially working with a fuzzy definition of it. There's ways to deal with fuzzy boundaries, and one way of doing that is with certain set of spatiotemporal smoothing methods, which I've done in some of my papers. Again, buy me a beer and I'll talk about it for way too long. But yeah, it's there's no clean definition, and anyone who says they have a clean definition, I'm highly skeptical of. You just have to operationalize it however is relevant for your theory, which is sort of the main thing. So
fantastic. So I think we should stop here. This was a great overview of actually you covered many more questions than that, which was fantastic. There is more questions that you can ask both Charles and Kai while we are having some drinks or something to eat outside. I would like to thank the speakers. Really fantastic talk. I would like everybody for having attended. I wanted to, if I can do this. I wanted to bring up the next events that we have. If you want to attend, and thank you again very much. Thank you.